Welcome to this spring edition, the very first spring edition of Streaming Media Advanced Forum. I'm Tim Siglin, a contributing editor with Streaming Media Magazine, and also the founding executive director of Help Me Stream. I think last month, a few of us were in the UK for Streaming Forum. This month, we're spread back out across the country, actually across the world, because we've got several people from over in Europe. I'm going to start first with you, Dom, to do an introduction, but what I want each of you to do is talk briefly about what April Fool's thing sort of caught your attention in the technology world. So, Dom, take it away.
Oh, you caught me out there. You caught me out there. Is that an April Fool itself?
Yes.
Well, I can't remember the one I mentioned 5 minutes ago now. That's the short-term memory loss. What was it I was talking about 5 minutes ago?
We were talking about Ready Player One, I think, was one of the ones.
Oh, no, I can't remember. I was too busy trying to pull my kids off chocolate on Sunday morning.
That is the problem with having Easter and in April Fools on the same day, isn't it?
Yes, I won't make a highly atheist joke about that because it would be inappropriate.
I was just going to say that.
Anyway, let's move on swiftly. Hi, I'm Dom. Welcome back to SMAF. Thanks, Tim. How's life?
Yeah, doing well. Actually, I was going to say there is no fake news.
No.
So, let's see. We'll pick up JT. Introduce yourself. April Fools. Anything that caught your attention?
Yeah. So Jason Thibeault, executive director of the Streaming Video Alliance. I have no sense of humor, so I was fooled by nothing.
Okay. All right. Magnus, what about you? I understand you actually helped create one.
Actually, we did. My name is Magnus Svensson, work at Ivan Technology, and for those who didn't see it, we sent out an April Fool's joke about optimizing compression by removing unnecessary scenes in movies. And some on this panel actually went really bite into it. I won't mention any names.
Is that your way of handing it over to me, Magnus? Yes, I bit, because I figured that, we've gotten to the point where we're doing content and context-aware encoding. So what's the next logical step? Well, to get rid of some of that content. But anyway, I'm Eric Schumacher Rasmussen, the VP and gullible editor-in-chief of Streaming Media. I guess admitting you're gullible isn't something that a journalist should do. But anyway, I just did. So take that for what you will. And
I think these days it's a necessary criteria, isn't it, Eric?
In the job description.
You can say gullible and skeptical, and I think those two things together are definitely good for being a journalist.
Thanks, Dave.
So the one that I actually got caught on was I've just rejoined Facebook, and one of our other colleagues in the industry posted something that said Ready Player One was available for 1 day for free on Apple TV. And I thought it was just a Canadian thing because he's Canadian. It turns out it was a April Fool's thing. So right here at the top of the hour, I want to talk about a couple of the big events that are coming up in the next few weeks and months. The first one is NAB, and that one, of course, takes place the second week in April. In fact, several of us will be there starting Sunday. That show this year has actually morphed from being a broadcast show to being what they're calling the MET effect, MET, Media, Entertainment, and Technology. And for those of us that are going to be there, I think it's one of those shows that is moving fairly rapidly into just as much about OTT and OTT live linear as it is about broadcast. JT, what's sort of your take about the way that shows like NAB are morphing from traditional broadcast shows into more on the streaming side?
Well, so that's a tough one. I actually disagree with you.
All right, go for it. That's why we're here.
So the fundamental transformation that's happening is a generational one where broadcasters are moving from traditional broadcast like QAM delivery to IP. So that's what NAB is about. NAB is about the transition from QAM to IP. So replacing all your equipment and your gear and what do you do and what services you need. And then on top of that is the transition from gear to cloud. And so you've got a lot of broadcasters experimenting with how much can I put my video workflow in the cloud? And then on top of that, you've got that consumer bent, which is OTT, right? So how do I deliver to all these people on all their devices? So I think there's a growing trend around OTT and online video in shows like NAB and IBC and stuff like that. But the core of those shows is about helping these broadcasters transition to IP and then to the cloud.
And
So
I would just
sorry,
add
go
to
ahead.
that. We were saying before, before the webcast started that, you know, for those of us who come from the streaming side, it sometimes is a good reminder going to a show like NAB that to a lot of broadcasters, for instance, the cloud is still a relatively novel and untested idea. Whereas for those of us on the streaming side, it's old hat at this point. And, you know, NAB, they started with that MET, Media and Entertainment and Technology Effect branding, I think 2 years ago. Joking with someone then that I thought, you know, maybe in 5 years, are they going to change the name of the show? But I think JT hit on the reason that that's not going to happen anytime soon.
I think what JT mentioned was actually reflecting a lot what I see from our customers, that exactly transition is what they need help with and what we're providing help with at the moment. Moving from technologies like cable to IP and moving from on-premise to cloud.
And I know sitting in meetings at NABs 4 or 5 years ago, FIFA and some of the other large content owners who had venues were saying their fear of the cloud was, honestly, there was nobody to sue if it went wrong. So in that regard, they had to have sort of content specialists that they worked with, you know, like an Accenture or somebody like that, to be able to say, we'll help you create that total solution. Now, JT, you mentioned before the top of the hour about the education you're doing around advertising. Tell me how that sort of ties into this model where a traditional broadcaster, as you say, is moving from QAM to IP. Are they having to relearn how they do ads because they have the ability to do pre-rolls, interstitials, et cetera? Or is your education around that much more to the people from the streaming space trying to become broadcasters?
So, you know, great question. It's a little bit of both. Obviously, you know, what you have right now with broadcasters who are dipping their toe into OTT services and TV everywhere services, and you know, the advertising is shifting slowly over, right? I mean, I would probably say anecdotally that still 93% of all video advertising is done via traditional broadcast. So there's, you know, they're moving over. They're trying to figure out, can I use my existing Black Arrow solutions or my Tanbird boxes to do, you know, parody? Can I have the same ad showing on the television that I have in my live stream or my VOD asset? And can I switch them out dynamically? And so there's all sorts of challenges that streaming introduces to the whole advertising, you know, realm, and they're trying to figure those, you know, how to solve those problems out, and all the technology vendors are as well. But it's you know, what we're trying to do from an educational standpoint is we're really focusing in on those people who are actually, you know, doing the advertising in streaming. So for example, like a Sky, right? So Sky does a tremendous amount of video advertising in their streaming, and so, you know, they want to understand what's the impact of those ads on the experience. Like what can I expect my users to do if they get a black screen instead of an ad, or if the ad is a really low bit rate instead of the HD quality they're getting for the stream itself. So that's what we're trying to help them, you know, tackle.
Interesting. And you're talking about Black Arrow boxes. It's funny, I hadn't even heard that name in quite some time, but for broadcasters, it was clearly a thing. There was a company actually in the space called Terion, probably 15, 16 years ago, who did the cherry pruner. So they had the cherry picker and the cherry pruner. The cherry pruner was actually designed to allow cable companies who were moving to IP to actually lower the bit rate for an overall channel. So you could charge premium for a channel, say, that was coming in at, you know, at 1080p, lower for one at 720p, lower still for one that was slightly below 720p. And what they started getting was requests for what you're talking about in advertising, to basically bump the advertising quality down against the quality, to match the quality of the content itself, because the cable companies didn't want people to see really pristine commercials and really badly encoded primary content.
Question, just question from Magnus. I've got a lot of echo. Magnus, have you got a public broadcaster out in your neck of the woods that gives you ad-free television?
We have the public broadcasters, but we also have a very good work ongoing in especially Sweden, but also the Nordic region, where we have aligned on how we will stitch in ads in TV Anywhere services and OTT services. We have done that with all broadcasters and made majority of the operators distributors in Sweden, and we have aligned. This is the way we're doing it. This is the way we're handling the problems that JT mentioned, and this is what we do when things go wrong.
Because I find it interesting. We often touch on advertising on SMAF, and I always feel like the odd one out, and I think that's just coming from the UK. There's just a sort of resigned, it's normal, this is the way television works from the stateside of the crew.
Very true.
Whereas from my side of the pond, if you like, I always feel like adverts shouldn't be just taken for granted as something we have to suffer.
Nope.
I'm staunchly anti-advertising. I think we're definitely seeing a cultural split between people who can afford to subscribe their way out of advertising and kids who aren't programmed by advertising and so on. And yet you go, especially, and I always found that more at NAB, there's just an absolute acceptance that advertising is how everything is funded and how everything works, and therefore it is as intertwined with television as the bits and bytes of the technology that delivers it.
Fascinatingly, Dom, we didn't start out that way. We started out with sponsorship models, which is why when I got into streaming, I found that really fascinating. So early in the States, we would have you'd have a full hour. That hour would be sponsored by whatever, JFG Coffee, I think was one of the ones. So you'd have the programming going. It would be a live studio audience. And at some point, the MC would stop, turn to the camera, hold up a can of JFG Coffee and talk about how good it was, and then put it down and turn back around, and they'd continue on with the entire thing. That clearly, there were problems differentiating between what was entertainment and what was advertising. And so and it started with young kids here on Saturday mornings with cartoons, where there had to be a clear delineation between what was commercial and what was entertainment. And you couldn't use the same characters, for instance, to sell to the kids that were in the actual cartoon that they were watching. So we've been there. And I agree with you. I'm anti-advertising as well, which is why ultimately I primarily watch Netflix, although I have DirecTV now. But at the end of the day, it drives the industry so heavily in the US, to JT's point, 93% basically still on standard traditional broadcast.
Yeah.
And even the younger audiences that you're talking about, Dom, so many of them are watching YouTube. And, I used to have this little fantasy in my head that, my son's just watching YouTube videos. He's not seeing ads. No, he's seeing plenty of ads on YouTube. And getting back to Tim's point about shows being sponsored, today you've got this very unclear definition of what is sponsored content, what is branded content. On a lot of the videos that my son, for instance, watches, he likes to watch these they've gone beyond unboxing videos, but there's EvanTube HD, for instance, who demonstrates toys and video games. They're not coming out and saying to their audience that they were given these games and given these toys to promote. They don't have to say that every episode. So in some ways, the clearly delineated advertising that Tim is talking about is less insidious than some of the alternatives.
But Eric, the FTC, I thought, at least for blog posts, you have to say, that you've received compensation for it or product review. Are you saying that in videos that's not required at this point yet? I
guess I shouldn't say that authoritatively, but from anecdotally, it sure doesn't seem to be the case.
Interesting. And maybe you're right. Maybe they're allowed to, quote unquote, in a series to say it at the beginning of the series and then not necessarily have to say it for the next N number of videos. Huh.
Right. And when it's an open-ended series, do they ever have to say it again?
Right. Not like public radio or public television, where at the top of the hour they have to say who they are and how they're funded. So
right.
Interesting. Let me actually take that as a really quick segue. We'll come back to conferences like Stream Media East, but let's talk, Dom, you had mentioned at the top of the hour, and Eric mentioned YouTube, of course, the social responsibility piece. Just talk a little bit about that. I'll talk about the article that I wrote last year, and then we'll move off that back into the conference setting.
Well, I don't know how many of you guys on the webcast had to do it, but obviously the YouTube shooter 2 days ago prompted me to, as soon as I saw that come through, it prompted me to send an email to the various people I know who work in YouTube and go, "Are you all right?" and come back, and that obviously brings it very close to home. But there was a couple of stories. I don't think we got them in the Flipboard feed because I think it branches out a long way from really the technology focus that I think is at the heart of our topics here. But there certainly have been a couple of stories this week about it. I think it was an Instagram and a Facebook live shooting that happened live on air and so on. It's interesting that the fact that it happened on a live streaming platform seemed to be more important than somebody getting killed, which I think is a little bit sad. But that's
it goes to the point too that everybody knows who YouTube is. So even, as you say, for us, it hits close to home because we know people who work there. But it is beyond Facebook. It is the #1 consumption platform, and the fact that you had somebody who was a content creator who was actually being compensated by YouTube to do things, who then, for all intents and purposes, as I understand it, had developed a fairly strong hate, not just for people that she knew within there, but for the platform as a whole, to be able to go and sort of randomly do this. Yeah, that certainly is impactful.
Just to chip in there's I think there's something of a parallel with people who start up a business and invest too much too early with an expectation of earning too much money, and then become extremely frustrated with their audience for not buying their content. And I think in her case, there was some posts going around. You never know what's real or not these days, but there was some posts going around that she'd earned sort of $30 or something for all the effort of making all these hundreds of videos that she'd made and so on. And I think I always term those projects yacht projects. You see a lot of people who retire sort of in their 50s from some company or another, take their money and think, what I need to do now is start up a streaming platform and become a television star. And then they're really good customers for us as technologists, but it takes about 18 months before they realize that frankly nobody is ever going to watch their kind of slightly obscure program, and that's just the way it is, and I think that's the sort of thing that drives people to crazy suicidal acts, unfortunately. So I think we've this type of technology in some ways probably opens that out in some ways.
Right. And Tim, you mentioned, and this actually connects to our discussion about advertising on YouTube. Not only is YouTube the most popular platform in the world, it's one that many people, both creators and audiences, identify with very personally. They feel a strong affinity towards the platform. If you attend VidCon in Anaheim every year, and now they have them in Amsterdam and Australia as well, you can really see the degree, and it's a little bit frightening. It's more than a little bit frightening. The degree to which, to quote The Simpsons, these people have welcomed their insect overlords, without necessarily critically thinking about why is YouTube doing what it's doing. They're not doing it out of a place of magnanimity, and so I think you're right that Dom, when you say that there is a parallel between that, the person who thinks they're going to start a streaming channel and get rich, but there's also a sense of expectation that I think especially young people have about YouTube that's unrealistic and potentially disturbing.
Well, and it's also interesting to think, as you say that, about platform loyalty as well, because remember Vimeo tried to come in at a time and sort of take away a number of the stars from YouTube, and they succeeded in getting sort of dual stars, people who would stay on YouTube and be on Vimeo, but the Vimeo star sort of faded from that standpoint. Everybody came back to YouTube. The article that I remember I asked you if I could write last year, Eric, I believe that we titled it "Dying to Stream," was around the idea of live streams of suicides or self-harm. And Dom mentioned the Instagram one where somebody was shot live on air this last year. I really think the industry has to self-regulate from that standpoint. We don't have sort of the equivalent of a dump button, and given the pushback on Facebook reading our private Facebook messages and that kind of thing, I don't know whether we can get to that point. But ultimately, I do think there's there's a point at which the industry has to figure out how to address this, because we're making it too easy to have a platform for those kinds of uncensored things. And trust me, I'm libertarian enough that I don't want that, but also having young daughters, I don't want anybody to have the idea of being able to use that platform to get attention for something that would inflict harm on themselves.
I think in some ways we've been quite lucky. You know, the emergence of streaming 15, 20 years ago really disrupted the recording industry, and that upset a lot of people in the recording industry. And then streaming turned up and started to disrupt the industry, various industries that it relates to. But just about the time where it was going to really upset the big broadcasters and start becoming a real challenge, you know, over the last maybe 3-4 years and so on. Of course, it was dramatically eclipsed by social media as a sort of more broad concept. And I think once the furore that's going on around social media dies back, it might well be that I don't know. Did you have Mary Whitehouse as a censor? No. Okay. Well, so we used to have this fierce old lady who was probably a clone of Margaret Thatcher, who used to stomp around trying to get pretty much everything that was live on TV that wasn't broadcast by the senior editor of the BBC taken off air because it was offensive to somebody somewhere. And I think, you know, I've always expected somewhere down the line someone to try to regulate streaming in some way or another. And you know, actually there are regulations that affect what you do on any type of broadcast material, but it's just so incredibly difficult to pin anyone down. If they want to start up a channel talking about streaming technology, they can't shut us up, really. You know?
That is part of the revolution in play, isn't it?
That's it.
Tim, your point about the industry self-regulating, you know, we may have, at least on one level, more with social media, you know, with all of the news that's come out about Facebook and Cambridge Analytica, without going down a political road necessarily. You know, you're seeing how now Facebook is sort of being dragged kicking and screaming into some sort of regulation, whether that's externally imposed or they impose something internally. You know, I think you're right that it makes a lot more sense, and it'll be better for everyone if the streaming video industry, such as it is, and it's difficult because there is no NAB equivalent for the streaming industry. But you know, an industry body, the SVA is, you know, deals with technical issues, but you know, it's probably time, I think, for the industry to look at those questions and provide some answers rather than just skate on the assumption that that they're too big to fail, too big to regulate.
And I know that Magnus, of course, the Nordics have always been a little bit radical with their approach. You had the Pirate Party, didn't you, who really went crazy for almost pro-piracy strategies and so on.
Yeah, but that is definitely calmed down. But at the same time, as the industry needs to regulate itself, who decides on what is suitable to air and who is not, and how can you stop? Because it's so damn easy to start up a streaming service on your own. You don't even need to go through Facebook and anything like that.
Yeah. Very true. All right, so let's switch back real quick. We have a Content Delivery Summit. We have Stream Media East. JT, are you involved in Content Delivery Summit?
Correct. Yeah, I'm the chair of that conference.
Okay, so let's talk briefly about that.
All right. It's going to be a fantastic conference. So we, you know, originally kind of set out to define a lot of topics around how content delivery has changed. So things like edge compute and things like LTEB, and how are these new technologies impacting the way people are delivering content, you know, to whatever device and whatever kind of content they're delivering. And it's kind of funny, but as the program really shaped out, it has come around a lot to video. So people are really interested in, I think, listening to and speaking about, you know, what is the impact of video on my network? How can I reduce latency? How can I deliver it better? And it goes in line with what, you know, Cisco's been predicting, right? That like 81% of all IP traffic in 2020 is going to be video, right? So we know that's where it's at. And so the conference has a lot of interesting topics and speakers. I'm really excited about it. We've got some good panels lined up. We've got a great keynote from PPSN at Verizon Digital Media Services. So it's shaping up to be a very interesting day of talking about, you know, how do you deliver ultimately video better?
And PPSN, was he the one who was at Yahoo when they were doing the football?
Yep.
Okay, interesting. Got it. Eric, the bigger picture streaming media East, I think Dom's going to bring up here on the Flipboard a little bit about that program. Tell us about that, though.
Well, the Content Delivery Summit is held the day before Streaming Media East, but it's in some ways part of the bigger Streaming Media East excuse me, event. Streaming Media East is May 8th and 9th in New York at the New York Hilton Midtown. We've announced all of our keynoters. We've got Aaron Connolly, who is the director of product for Facebook Live. We've got Christopher Fettner, who is head of global partnerships for Netflix, and he's going to be presenting actually a panel similar to one he did at Streaming Forum in London a few years ago, where he sits down with a number of Netflix partners, both internally and externally, including people like the cinematographer for Jessica Jones and Luke Cage. Someone from Technicolor will be there. Someone from a film studio will be there, and talk about how Netflix sort of bridges the gap between content and technology. Make sure that
when he did that at Forum, that was actually a really great panel because it allowed people both who are on the content side and the delivery side to understand how an aggregator like Netflix works to marry the two.
Right. And you really get a sense of all the moving pieces that are involved with simply bringing a single show or a single series or even a single movie to a platform like Netflix that's global. And then we have a closing keynote. For the first time ever, we are having a closing keynote on Wednesday of Streaming Media East. And that will be Rachel Burke, who is with the Google Android Play store, and is going to talk about the connected living room and streaming subscriptions. And so combine that with all the sessions in between, and I'm really excited about the event. And one last plug, we have a new event, part of Streaming Media East this year, called Video Marketing Power Summit. That's exactly what it sounds like. It's a whole day devoted exclusively to video marketing and advertising. And Troy Dreyer, who edits our sister site onlinevideo.net, has got just a killer lineup of speakers from Mashable, Google, the IAB, Nielsen, talking about all of the advertising and marketing related things that are so on the top of people's minds right now. So I'm really looking forward to it.
Cool. Good deal. And I'm glad that you're programming these here in the States now, because I've really enjoyed what you've done at Streaming Forum in London for a number of years. I'll be there, of course, doing interviews like I seem to be roped into doing. I think at Streaming West I did 18. I actually really enjoy just getting to hear what people are up to and what new companies they're with. So that provides me sort of a segue. Magnus, I've never met you, and I know probably a number of people in our audience haven't met you. So tell us a little bit about yourself and your company as well.
Yeah, I work at iWin Technology since 2 years back now, and that is a independent streaming media expertise team. We're 24 experts in streaming media, all from compression to clients. And what we do is we help our customers to pick the right solution, and we also help them to implement it. And prior to sitting at iWin, I spent 20 years at Ericsson, where the last 10, 15 with the media parts of Ericsson, part of the acquisition flow that we did and moving on. So an independent consultant that worked with helping customers as an advisor, solution architect, technical product managers.
And what do you find is sort of the biggest challenges within Sweden as you're branching out into Norway and the Nordics that companies need help, that these companies need help with?
At the moment, I think the hottest topic we have in the Nordic region is what we mentioned before with advertising in OTT and TV services. That today there are very little means of getting paid for it and getting the viewability and getting the statistics around the advertising. So what we have been doing as part of iWin is helping the broadcasters together with distributors in the Nordic region to make a common spec and common technical architecture, how this will be done and how we should do it. And we're actually live with a couple of broadcasters and one of the distributors in Sweden that will spread throughout the Nordic. So I think that has been the hottest topics in the floors in Stockholm at the moment and in Nordic.
Interesting. And JT, to Magnus's point about advertising and sort of setting standards and like that, how does how does SVA play in that role besides just education?
Well, I mean, so we are a technically focused trade association, so we look to solve, technical challenges, but we're not a standards body. One of the things that we decided was, because of the way and how quickly online streaming was moving, standards take years to ratify. And by the time you get a standard in place for something streaming, the technology's moved past it, 24 months previously. So we really focus on specifications, on best practices, on educational material, as well as functional and technical requirements. We want to help companies be able to provide a better video experience for their audiences, but at the same time, we don't want to get mired down in sort of the politics or bureaucracy of standards development. So we work with other orgs to do that. We ship our stuff off to places like the CTA or the IAB or SMPTE, and we let them take action against those and build standards on top of the materials we create.
Interesting. And are those, when you look at things like SCUDY 35, which is obviously a standard, are those things primarily North American focused for the SBA, or are you looking at Europe and the US, or global?
Well, thankfully, because we're doing best practices and specifications, that aren't really tied to a governing body, implementing them, we can do things globally, right? So if we develop something around like the best practices for video quality in online advertising, somebody in Southeast Asia can pick that up, somebody in Central Europe can pick that up, somebody in North America can pick that up, and sort of adhere to the best practices and say, yeah, that's what we want to do with our advertising. We want to make sure that we adhere to these, but they're not required to, and we don't push it, on them. We're just delivering informational resources to the industry as a whole.
Got it. Interesting. So Magnus, from the standpoint of, as you're making these decisions within the Nordics, what impact does that have in terms of you're being able to branch out to talk to companies, say, in Germany or France or other places in Europe that may not necessarily adhere to those sort of de facto standards you're doing in the Nordics? Would you take the best practices into the rest of Europe, or would you work to the best practices that are already at play within those non-Nordic parts of Europe?
What we have done, actually, we haven't really invented any new tech standards or any standard. We have basically specified what part of the standards that should be used and should not be used, and what is optional and what is mandatory. So what we have done is very much applicable throughout the world, I would say. It's just a matter of, we have defined this is the way we interpret the standards, and this is the way it's implemented. We have done a couple of add-ons, like an ad server proxy, for instance, that we can translate from the specific ad server used by the broadcaster. But other than that, we're working with completely standardized interfaces, and we're not reinventing anything.
Okay, interesting. And I think so to a certain extent, it's almost like what with Dash as the standard, where the Dash IF came in to say, here's a subpart of the standard that we're going to implement to allow for consistency across the delivery.
Yeah, because that will help if all broadcasters and operators are defining their own way of interpreting how to feed in ads into the simulcast streams. It will be a nightmare for all of them. So, and we have had a really great responsiveness from all vendors that have been, or all parties that have been involved in this work, that no disagreements and no political fights. We just try to align, this is where we're doing it. This will be cheaper for all of us, and this will be, first of all, a better experience for the end user, because that's the end of the day, that's the goal. You don't get black screens, you don't get blurry advertising and all these things.
So guys, can I just chip in? You mentioned Dash there, Tim.
Yep.
Is Dash a thing?
It has been a thing. I guess the question is, it seemed to me in Europe, I'll throw that back around to you and Magnus, it seemed to me that in Europe, Dash was actually getting more traction than it was in the States. And of course, JT, I'm sure, has some opinion on that as well with the Dash IF. But what's your sense in Europe? Dom, I'll take that back to you first.
Okay, well, I'm going to continue with the theme of cheeky comments, but I have a feeling that RTMP will be around longer than Dash.
Well, it certainly will be around for quite some time.
I just, I mean, the reason I asked that is, yes, of course, you see Dash touted a lot. You see people playing with it a lot, and you see some people claiming some fairly big customers with it. I mean, we've got some fairly big customers, and we've never been actually asked to implement it in production.
Well, now you've got SMAF as well. So
say again.
So now you've got SMAF as well. So
exactly. I'm not seeing it coming. It's sort of coming in about as quickly as RTMP is going out.
So let's real quick. Let's make sure we define for the audience. Dash is dynamic adaptive streaming via HTTP, which is essentially a standards-based version of what everybody knows is the de facto standard, which is HTTP live streaming that Apple has. They're clearly not the same thing, but you do have a manifest file in one, and what is it, a PID in the other? I can't remember what the term is on the Dash side. SMAF, JT, remind us what that acronym stands for.
Oh, I knew you were going to do that. I can't remember that.
Common Media Application Format, isn't it?
Common Media Application Format, and it's essentially based around MP4 as well, right? Is that correct? Okay? So at the heart of it all, we have MP4, and Dom, maybe to your point, one of the reasons that implementation hasn't been done for Dash is that Apple stepped up and said, we'll do late binding, we'll do byte range addressing within an MP4 file. So you no longer have the inherent problem of M2TS, MPEG-2 transport stream segments. You have that ability to basically put an MP4 there with the audio and alternate audio and have the packaging happen at that moment. That was one of the big benefits of Dash. That was one of the big benefits of Adobe's HDS and Microsoft Smooth, was late binding or late addressing. And now that seems to sort of be moot because of the fact that Apple's HLS supports that.
Well,
and that's
I mean, it may be rumor, but I've anecdotally also heard that Apple are gradually pulling up the ladder on other formats as well. So just with my internet radio hat on, there's certainly word. I haven't seen it verified yet, but there's word around that they're going to drop progressive download and shoutcast/icecast streaming in the HTML5 media objects, so that Apple devices will only stream HLS in due course. So the industry certainly doesn't seem to be moving at a big level. The industry doesn't seem to be moving towards Dash in my books. I might be wrong and I might be missing something, but 3 years ago, I think about the covers of trade magazines and so on and so forth, and it was being shouted out as if this was the great big new thing, and I just haven't seen it arrive. I haven't seen anybody asking for it.
It's interesting you say that, and I want to come back to Magnus and ask him, but I remember back in 2011 writing the joint white paper for Adobe and Microsoft around the idea of an MP4, fragmented MP4, etc. And that ultimately morphed into what was Dash, and Dash was supposed to be the standard that everybody works to. But as JT said, a standard takes 24 months or 48 months to implement, and at that point, the rest of the world has moved on. Magnus, from your standpoint, Dash implementations, are you?
We still see it in Sweden quite often, and I think we're seeing a trend that both is needed. The problem with Dash is it's a wider standard, and it's so many interpretations. So coming back to that insertion again, it's a lot easier to do that in HLS than versus MPEG Dash, because you can do it in many ways in MPEG Dash, and in HLS you can do it in very few ways.
And do you find the DRM, the common encryption scheme, part of Dash beneficial? I know Marlin was big in Europe in terms of digital rights management, and then it seemed like Widevine and others sort of took over. Is that one of the reasons to use Dash?
Not yet, I would say, because if you still need HLS, you still need to encrypt it differently for Apple than for Dash. So you still need to encrypt it twice and all these things. So the benefits are not there yet, even though I know that the browser vendors are getting closer to align when it comes to the encryption methods. And then we probably can have the same format, and then it's just a matter of repackaging it either to Dash and HLS, and then the later you do that, the less burden you have on your networks.
Sure. JT, do you?
I'm pretty sure that we'll see both Dash and HLS moving forward.
JT, do you want to add anything from the Dash IF standpoint or the SBA standpoint?
Well, I mean, again, the problem with all of these competing standards and containers and codecs is workflow, right? So as a content distributor or a content owner, you've now got to figure out, how do I integrate and what do I need to integrate with my workflow in order to get the content I need out to the devices that are going to be able to consume it. And it's wickedly confusing, and there are significant business impacts to it. So that, I think, is probably the biggest. It's a business concern, the biggest concern that that distributors and owners of content are going to have in the near coming futures. It's not sorting through which one should I choose, but it's how many of them do I need to run simultaneously.
That's a really good point. Hey, Dom, you tossed something up here from the web chat. Go ahead and.
Yeah, no, I was just Jim's been chatting away with me in the chat room here, and also Paul Clark has just popped in and said thank you to Tim for a simple Dash explanation. I have to say, I couldn't have explained it as eloquently as you there, Tim. It would have just come out as burble from me.
And from Paul, I really appreciate that. So let's talk about a couple other competing standards, because I think this conversation actually pulls us very nicely into the whole HEVC AV1. And Dom, to my point to you about how the benefit of Dash with the fragmented MP4 sort of being lost as a benefit when Apple began to support that, I see sort of a parallel as we get to the AV1 HEVC licensing issue. And I want to step back real quick to set the stage, and then we'll come back and talk about this. But if those of you remember from probably at this point, it was probably 8 years ago, Jan Ozer and I wrote articles around the licensing labyrinth that was AVC or H.264. And at that point, On2 was innovating really well with VP7 and VP8, arguing that they were royalty-free, not telling the average person, of course, that it cost a massive amount of money to buy the On2 codec if you were the content publisher. And AVC through, I believe it was MPEG LA at that point, the licensing body. That's
right. Yep.
Was pushing to charge for streaming, charge royalties for streaming. And of course, somewhere around the 2010, 2011 timeframe, they backed off of it and said, you know what, we're going to wait until 2015, which allowed AVC to become more established. And then ultimately, I believe in 2013, they said, you know what, we're not even going to charge those royalty fees. Part of that seemed to be that they were setting the stage to then come forward with HEVC, because a number of those same patent holders in HEVC were also part of AVC or H.264. We then entered this era for the last 2 years where there was uncertainty around licensing for HEVC. And in fact, we have the ongoing problem of having MPEG LA as one licensing body and MPEG Advance is the other licensing body. Of course, recently, right here at the beginning of the year, the Advance group decided that they weren't going to charge royalties for streaming or for even, I believe, over the air and cable. They would only charge those royalties for physical media like Blu-ray discs or something along those lines. My personal feeling is they waited a little too long, because if they had done that before AV1 was sort of code frozen, they would have had a chance to grow the market. But we're now in a position where AV1 is almost ready to go. We still have a licensing uncertainty around HEVC because of the second license group, patent pool. What do you all think? I mean, to me, it made sense for the AVC scenario. It almost seems like too little too late for HEVC, or do we feel like because at least one of the patent pools with HEVC has sort of woken up and realized where we're going, that ultimately HEVC will get more traction now before AV1 has a chance to pick up and run?
First of all, I believe it will take a while before AV1 will pick up and run, because it is still very immature and it's not far from optimized. I'm pretty sure we will see quite some demos at NAB this coming week. But at the same time, are we sure that we won't see any standard bodies picking up something in AV1? I'm still worried that we'll see the same coming in, sneaking in there as well, even if they are been very cautious of not doing it. But at the same time, I believe we'll see both competing for a couple of years more.
From my point of view, I think we're going to see, if I can get my desk to give me my video back, I think we're going to see, well, you can't see me, that's probably no bad thing. I think we're getting diminishing returns for the investment people are making into codecs. I don't think it makes a material difference to the end user once you start getting even into 4K. I think it makes so the investment that you need to make to introduce a new codec to market is not giving the end user a significant difference. So really, it's the broadcast distribution technology, you know, the platform in between the content producer and the content consumer, paying less for the technology that's going to make a difference. And as this commoditizes more and more rapidly, and we get to a point where we're getting effectively probably something that is royalty free, then certainly I think anything that's not free, unless it offers a significant difference in technical capability to the end user, I think they're just going to drop away. So that's a key thing, you know. I mean, the differences that I see between H.264 and H.265 are nominal in any real terms. I
would agree at this point. It's not optimized, just like AV1 is not optimized.
Exactly.
So I want to put a little plug in. I wrote a blog post for Wowza on this. The blog post was called "Do Codecs Matter?" And ultimately, this is sort of the question, Dom. If you've got something in the middle of the solution, whether it's a media server, whether it's a transcoder, at the end of the day, for the end consumer, as long as they can consume through the same apps they're used to, then, you know, there doesn't seem to be a problem. My big concern is, do we now force applications on mobile, on desktop, to support multiple codecs? And if that's the case, does it become a player war again, as opposed to a codec war? JT, Eric, do you guys have any sort of thoughts on the AV1 HEVC?
Yeah, I mean, we actually just ran a webinar at the SVA, which had a bunch of encoding people on it, talking about sort of content formats for 2018 and beyond. And the feelings that I got from those participants were really about HEVC is probably going to win out. Because it has such a momentum already behind it. To Magnus's point, AV1 is still sort of not optimized. People are just kind of testing it out, kicking the tires. But HEVC is already on devices as a decoding piece of software. It's already been distributed through TV sets and handhelds and whatnot. And you got browser support coming for it. And so it's I think that codecs matter to the people preparing content. And they matter because, like what I said before, business decision, right? So how does this impact my workflow and my ability to get my content to all these devices? But I mean, if I use HEVC and I can get the same quality bit rate as AVC, but with half the bits, that's going to save me money on delivery. So, again, so there's all these business decisions to be made around sort of what codec to choose. And then the question about multiple codecs, totally. Right, you're going to have content owners will probably have to have multiple codecs to deliver to get content in the right formats to deliver to all their devices that people are using. It's crazy.
And I thought we learned that lesson 15 years ago with Real and Microsoft.
Certainly not.
Yeah, and it seems like we're right back. And it's almost the same scenario we had where we learned the lesson on DVDs, and then when it came time for high definition DVDs, we had Blu-ray and HD DVD. So,
but I think there's a difference. Even 3 months ago, I remember writing in for something for the magazine about at the end of the day, the audience traditionally had something forced down their throat, and then streaming disrupted that because the audience could turn up with their own device and dictate what they wanted to be what they wanted delivered to them, which created a massive sort of diversification, if you like, much wider range of choices. And even today, anyone who says something's going to win, they're probably mental, because at the end of the day, you know, it's not something that will be won. It's because MP3 is still around. These things don't just go away. If people like consuming stuff in a particular way, that legacy device stays there. But I do think that we are going back to my diminishing returns point. If there are diminishing returns, then the new devices, I think we start needing to engage back onto, strangely bucking my own trend and about abstraction from hardware. I still think that there is something that's not well addressed within the codec space, and that is the portability of the technology to other devices. I look for you know, an emergence when Intel QuickSync came out, and Meteor SDK as it's called now. I look for an emergence of GPUs out in the cloud which I could use hardware acceleration and drop a codec onto. But Jesus, I mean, I play with that stuff on a daily basis, and it is I can't use the word on air, but it is difficult to get these codecs to run even on two apparently identical chipsets. To make a codec portable is not easy. And in fact, I think we spend a lot of time with the guys who run browsers talking about player technology, because that's all very high profile and in the face of the consumer. And if you mess it up, it's quite a big PR disaster. But actually, there's a gulf between the chip vendors and the hardware guys who can really start to scale things out, and the guys writing the codecs. The codecs are being developed on very specific platforms, and then trying to get them out of those platforms and make them portable. We're not there yet.
Well, and this goes to some of the things we were talking about early on with Black Arrow and other companies like that. Optibase was one of these companies in the early days. You had, you know, everything was sort of hardware assisted, and then it moved to software because the general purpose processor rose to a level that it could handle it. HEVC, you know, we're sort of writing that. It's true, it's on devices, but we're writing that to very specific new devices. One of the things that I really liked about On2, and I hope that the Alliance for Open Media and AV1 continues this trend, was On2 with VP6, VP7, VP8 actually allowed you to do it to decode it at least on lower speed processors as they move forward with the codec. So they were really optimizing. And this to me is the only question that I have around AV1 versus HEVC is HEVC is so intense from a decoding standpoint. If AV1 has a scenario where it will actually decode on old devices or older devices, then it may actually gain some traction.
But well, also I think there's an emergence of FPGA on the chipset coming through, and I think if somebody in the codec space capitalizes on developing an abstraction, a proper abstraction of that, so that codec developer could, a generic codec developer can, or two different generic codec developers could drop their codecs onto any FPGA because it's well interfaced. That will make a difference because devices will get cheaper, and that will make a difference to the consumer.
And that's what Texas Instruments did a number of years ago, remember, with Da Vinci, where they abstracted the DSPs. You're essentially arguing for that from an FPGA standpoint, and that would be phenomenal. But it's
or even a GPU standpoint, frankly, you know, it's still not there in the GPU. NVIDIA and CUDA, it's just not. You know, it's still a heavy-duty thing to plug into a chipset. Intel QuickSync is a much better way forward, but even that's a peg. You know, it takes a day to sit and port that into a new hardware environment, because it's tricky stuff.
And then you have Apple actually, you know, moving to its own silicon, and if that's the case, and the model you're talking about with IceCast and Shoutcast being deprecated, ultimately what they're doing is their own chipset optimized for HLS, which then entrenches HLS even further into the marketplace.
Which is also a big problem, because even, you know, you look at half the articles that are coming out, half the topics at Content Delivery Summit, half the topics at Streaming Media East this year, entire sessions at NAB, the problem in the industry is latency.
Absolutely.
And HLS is the wrong bloody way to go for latency. It's just as, and you know, no matter how much marketing hype out there that there is, no peer-to-peer doesn't solve the HLS latency problem. There is just that it is inherently the wrong way to go.
Which is why RTMP is going to be around for quite some time.
Exactly.
Or WebRTC in some modified form. Yeah, you know, Dom,
Exactly.
you and I have been saying this for 10 years, and it's like the industry is finally waking up to, we boxed ourselves into something that inherently has a 2 to 6 second delay based on the segment sizes, at least for the initial startup. Yep.
And we had something else, you know, which we picked up in the preamble conversation, which JT, you know, eloquently pointed out, which is that, you know, the CDNs just don't have any interest in investing in the low margin. It might be high turnover, but it's low margin business of actually moving away from these HTTP based protocols. You know, it is. We are stuck behind their lack of interest to invest in that space. Actually, most of the problems in streaming media were sorted out by 2002 with session-based protocols, but they weren't. But the economic model that the CDNs had, which was pleasing their shareholders fundamentally, has completely ridden over us roughshod with that, and we're all kind of stuck now behind this environment where we have to deal with HTTP, and more often than not we have to therefore deal with HLS. But they are the wrong technologies. They are the VHS technologies, and we are missing a trick, I think.
So I think, Eric, we need at some show, whether it's West or what have you, we need a topic on this, you know, getting rid of HLS. Even if from a topical standpoint, it's something that Dom and I and one or two other non-believers sort of pontificate in, to be radical enough to say, let's get rid of the problem child, which is the inherent HTTP delivery that Dom's addressing. So putting the bug in your...
You know, we go back to multicast. You know, I've always wanted to drive multicast out there because it's a great way to scale streaming and make things cost efficient. But now we've got an added problem that not only have we not got multicast out there, we've got this terrible, well, not terrible, but we've got this problem encumbered technology of HLS that people are consuming more and more of, which is, yeah, it's a runaway problem.
All right, we got 4 minutes left into the top of the hour. And by the way, Dom, I'm writing an article on next generation delivery, and I am having to fend off the peer-to-peer people who keep coming to me and saying, you know,
send them to me, I'll fend them off for you.
Well, Eric fortunately is allowing me to write a completely separate article on peer-to-peer, because I would end up explaining why peer-to-peer is semi-acceptable now after years of snake oil sales. And I just don't want to spend the time in that particular article. But top of the hour coming close. JT, you had mentioned 3 things to us before we started. One was advertising. The second one was a survey, if I remember correctly, you're doing on VR and 360 video. Is that something that that people can participate in now, or is the survey closed at this point?
Yeah, so I say a survey. I mean, traditional, like, you know, consumer survey, ask people questions. It's more of an expert market survey. So we had, you know, the experts in the SVA sort of look out at the market and gather information and bring it back, and we consolidated that and combined it into a report, and we'll publish that report probably. I'm hoping sometime in April, and then, you know, all of our documents are publicly available. So we'll announce that when that's available, and you know, people can download it and read it. It's about 70 pages, so it's a pretty meaty document.
Nice. Okay, and I'm actually doing a survey right now with Wowza around live user-generated content. Of course, they have Clearcaster, but looking at other platforms, and it's fascinating to see the feedback that people are giving in terms of which platforms they use for live content generation, sort of to the point we were talking about earlier. What was the third thing you talked about? It was another educational piece. I wanted to make sure we talk about that briefly.
Yeah, it's about forensic watermarking. So obviously that's a really big topic right now in the streaming industry, is, you know, how do I protect my content? And watermarking is becoming a topic of interest, and people don't really understand how to implement it. What are the different ways you can implement it? You know, what are the challenges of choosing one path versus another? So we've put together sort of, again, another best practices document, and that'll be hopefully published again in April.
And is this sort of the digital DNA or the music genome projects that were done in the past, where you could identify something without a visual watermark? This is invisible, I'm assuming.
Yeah. So forensic watermarking, you know, it's like pixel level changes across multiple frames, and then stitching those together as sort of like a unique fingerprint. And then embedding data within that fingerprint. So that's the forensic aspect of it, right? You pull that fingerprint out, you decode it, you go to your database and you say, oh, this person bought it at this IP address on this day and time. I'm going to go after them.
Okay, very good. So we're up at the top of the hour now. I guess, is everybody on this going on this forum going to NAB? Dom, are you coming over?
Sorry, I'm not this year. No.
Okay. All right, got it. So we'll make sure to send you great shots of sushi. Eric takes us or something like that. But I want to thank our guests, JT and Magnus, for being on here with us. Of course, Dom for sort of digitally or technically emceeing it, and Eric, I think you're going to end up taking.
Just a quick one. Can I just say thanks to Jim and Paul who've been chatting with me in the chat room, and do bring friends. It's all word of mouth, this one, so the more the merrier.
Absolutely. All right, Eric, final word, and then take us out with the sting.
The final word is we'll see you at NAB and Streaming Media East and Content Delivery Summit, and again next month on SMAF.